Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening if you're in India. It's our great privilege to bring you our first plenary session of this international conference organized by Inspirare Arts Foundation in collaboration with Osmania University Center for International Programs, Alliance Française du Bengal, and Progetto Migra. For our first plenary, we are absolutely privileged to have with us Professor John Mccourt, the University of Macerata in Italy. John is one of the foremost Joyce experts in the world, and the topic that he has chosen for today is Our Greater Ireland Beyond the Sea, Diaspora and Migrancy in Joyce's Ulysses. Now, we are just past Bloomsday and also St. Patrick's Day. It's only coincidental, John, that I'm wearing green. Uh, so the thing is that 1922, 2022, 100 years of Ulysses marks a wonderful journey of this great modernist novel. Uh, it has been suggested that all writing changed after Ulysses. So, as we have a BC and an AD, we have a before Ulysses and an after Ulysses, a BU and an AU perhaps. Uh, John has written a wonderful book which came out earlier this year, which is called Consuming Joyce 100 Years of Ulysses in Ireland. Uh, it's a wonderful book of how Joyce went from being reviled as a writer to being revered as a cultural icon. So it's a wonderful journey. It's a detailed account of how someone who was said to have created an odyssey for the sewer became someone who was considered in the late 90s and early 2000s in Irish print media as, along with Guinness and U2, perhaps Ireland's greatest export and also Ireland's greatest expat. So the journey, and today perhaps it's interesting to consider the fact that 1922 was that annus mirabilis in terms of European art, European literature, English literature perhaps. Of course, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland came in the same year, Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room, Marcel Proust's Sodom and Gomorrah came in the same year. So this is a wonderful year, and probably we can have a whole lot of literary celebrations right through the year with all these celebrated texts marking their anniversaries, 100th anniversaries. Uh, the point, I think, where John's going to step in today, perhaps, is for a long time, I think there was this debate between who's greater, the European choice or the Irish choice. I think the Irish choice started having a revival only in the 80s, if I'm not too mistaken, John.
Yeah,
Uh, so, and that also has a wonderful side, an Indian side to it, because there were people like Mulk Raj Anand in India, someone whom we consider the doyen or pioneer of English fiction writing in India. Towards the late 20s and early 30s, he's supposed to have gone over, and Sajjad Hussain and several other writers who managed to visit England and actually had some interactions with the Bloomsbury Group. Also, in the morning with our keynote, we were discussing Raja Rao's fiction, another great Indian English writer and icon, I should put it. Again, he had very close relations. He was Paris based for a long period of time and had lots of interactions with Joyce. And we know about the allusions to Indian mythology and religion in Joyce's Finnegan's Wake a lot. So, about this labyrinth that is life, about this journey, the great transatlantic journey, perhaps would also figure in John's discussions today. Uh, John is the co-founder, if I'm not wrong, of the Trieste James Joyce School. And he is the president of the James Joyce Association as well, the president-elect, if I am not really mistaken again. So without further ado, it's our great pleasure to have John Mccourt, Professor John Mccourt with us, talking about The Travelling of Irishness, Migrancy, Diaspora, and James Joyce's Ulysses. John, it's over to you now.
Thank you very much, Debashis. I'm very happy to be part of your conference and to have been invited by Inspirare, the Inspirare Foundation and the University of Osmania. I hope what I will have to say will be of some use as you come towards the end of your day there, I think. It's just about midday here in Italy. And your conference is looking at the impact of diaspora and migration on culture on a global scale. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about that theme through Joyce and through literature. Joyce, as you said, very pointedly and correctly, Ireland's biggest export and maybe Ireland's biggest expat. And Joyce, I think, helped lead the way for how Ireland came to terms with its expatriate community, its diaspora, who at one time just left and never came back and were largely forgotten and largely not welcomed on those occasions when they did come back. So there's an element about migrancy and diaspora in terms of Ireland, which I want to talk about. However, I'm also very aware that Joyce was writing Ulysses during the First World War, a time in Europe when migrancy, forced migrancy, was all too real. The relevance of Joyce's Ulysses today is, in a way, unfortunately, stronger than ever. Because remember, Joyce was writing Ulysses during the First World War. He was seeing Europe breaking up. Remarkable, the parallels. The Spanish flu was wreaking havoc around the world, between 25 million and 100 million deaths just because of that. And people were on the move for survival, trying to get away from trouble. And I don't think I need to be too obvious to point out the parallels with the situation that we're living in Europe today, with the situation in particular in Ukraine, where we now have 10 million displaced people. 3.5 million perhaps have managed to leave the country, but within Ukraine, a further 7 million have left, hopefully temporarily, their homes. But in many cases, we know that their homes won't be there when and if they can come back. Now that's happening very close to Europe. The Ukraine borders with Poland and other European countries. And we're seeing the influx of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians at the moment. So when Joyce and other writers deal with the theme of migrancy and war and global movement, it's unfortunately all too relevant still today, not just in Europe, but I can talk about it from a European point of view. I wouldn't presume to talk about it from anything other than a European point of view. At the beginning of the First World War, the London Spectator published a poem called The Refugees, which kind of reads quite relevantly to today. I'm just going to read it to you, if I may. The Refugees, and it's not signed by an author, but it was later published in an anthology in 1922. We're back to that year again, 1922. Past the marching men where the great road runs, out of burning Ypres, the pale women came. One was a widow. Listen to the guns. She wheeled a heaped up barrow. One walked lame and dragged two little children at her side, tired and coughing with the dust. The third nestled a dead child on her breast and tried to suckle him. They never spoke a word. So they came down along the Ypres road. The soldier stayed his mirth to watch them pass, turned and in silence helped them with their load, and led them to a field and gave them bread. I saw them hide their faces in the grass and cry as women might when Christ was dead. So this poem, perhaps not the greatest poem ever written, does, however, give voice to the situation of refugees, of people fleeing war, mostly women and children as the people who have to do this, while the men and the husbands and the fathers have to fight. Now, Joyce never dealt in any direct way with the First World War in his writing. However, it's there, It's there in the background. But he would have been very much aware of the literature that was being written, of the works that were being written around the time and published about civilians on the run, civilians leaving home, civilians being displaced. And Ulysses, if we like, it's all about displacement. No, Leopold Bloom wouldn't be in Ireland were it not for displacement, for the fact that his Jewish family felt the need to flee from Hungary and travel to Vienna and across to Milan and finally to land through London in Dublin. And to remember movements of populations past, in particular the Jewish population. So Joyce is very much aware of that. And Joyce's own life was a life of migrancy, of albeit involuntary, albeit voluntary exile, but the choosing to go away from home for economic reasons. Okay, Joyce's was a free decision. Of course, during war, many of these decisions are not free at all. The First World War led to huge movement on a scale that hadn't really been experienced before. It was a war, it has been said, of trains and trenches. Okay, so the people fleeing on the trains and people fighting in the trenches, and the size of what was often forced migration was unprecedented in Europe. For example, the Dutch population, which was 6 million at the time, was struggling to cope with the arrival of over 1 million Belgian refugees. That's one in six, if you think about it. 1 million Belgians for every 6 million Dutch. By the autumn of 2018, 2 million French civilians had left their homes in the course of the 4 years of fighting. In Russia, 6 million people had been uprooted. So the scale of movement in Europe was massive. And of course, it would be again massive in the Second World War. And now in the Ukrainian situation, it is massive. But there's also quite a lot of migration out of Russia, particularly those who are in disagreement with the war that Russia has declared. They're leaving in their hundreds of thousands and heading for other countries. Well, that's Europe. And Joyce always writes with the European context in mind. Okay? And so he alludes to this, if you like, through people like characters like Leopold Bloom and even Molly Bloom. He alludes to issues like colonialism and imperialism. We just think about Molly Bloom's father, Major Tweedy, who's part of the British forces down in Gibraltar and who evokes various battles of the past. But he's also, at the same time, and the Bassich made this point, this battle, if you like, for understanding Joyce through European or Irish eyes. But the two elements are always there in Joyce's writing, and neither excludes or should exclude the other. So when we think about diaspora in Irish, we talk about diaspora in Nail, the diaspora of the Irish. This refers to today to the Irish people, ethnic Irish people, and their descendants, who today live outside of the island, the small island of Ireland. Now, one of the things Joyce was very keen to underline always about Ireland was that Irish nationalists always liked to assert the idea of a pure Irish race that was uncontaminated in some sense. Joyce's point was very different. Joyce always pointed to the fact that we were contaminated, but that this was a positive thing. This idea of foreign influence in Ireland was a positive thing. Now, I'm not talking simply about a British presence in Ireland. I'm talking about centuries and more of mixing, which caused the Irish, like every other race, to be a mixed race. But then, of course, we have the Irish leaving Ireland. Migration from Ireland was recorded, or has been recorded, since the early Middle Ages, and we've been able to quantify it since about 1700. And since 1700, give or take, roughly 10 million people born in Ireland have emigrated. 10 million. Now remember, the current population of Ireland, the island today, is something over 5 million. Over these several hundred years, more than 10 million emigrated. And this is more than double, as I'm saying, the population of Ireland itself. At its peak, In the early 1840s, the population of Ireland reached about 8.5 million before the Great Famine. And the Great Famine, of course, which took place in mid-century, Black 47, 1847, 1845 to 1850, and saw a huge outflow of Irish people from the country. Perhaps as many as 1 million would emigrate, and at least 1.5 million more would die and wouldn't make it to a new life. The poorest of the Irish, of course, went to Great Britain, especially to cities like Liverpool. And those who could went further, went to the United States, for example, or to Canada. Emigration, leaving the country in order to survive, from well before this, however, was a very consolidated practice. By 1890, so now we take it up to Joyce's time. Joyce was born in 1882. In 1890, 40% of Irish-born people were living abroad. That's an incredibly large number. 40% of Irish-born people were living abroad. And by our own times, the 21st century, roughly 80 million people worldwide claim Irish descent. And that includes approximately 35 million Irish Americans who claim Irish as their primary ethnicity. But I'm more interested in 1890. Joyce was 8 years of age. And going back into Joyce's territory, emigration from Ireland was simply a normal, standard thing done for economic survival. And Ireland was and has been, ahead of times, in a sense, in finding a solution to its economic woes by exporting its people. And many countries far bigger than Ireland now follow a similar practice. But what is Ireland's attitude towards those who leave? And what is the attitude today of those countries who have millions of people now living outside its national territory, but who still feel a sense of profound belonging and profound pain, I suppose, in having had to leave? Joyce became a member of the Irish diaspora in 1904, when he left with Ireland with Nora Barnacle for his own reasons, partly because he needed to find the psychological space in order to write, and he found the very closed, nationalist, ultra-Catholic situation in Ireland didn't give him the kind of intellectual freedom that he needed. He wanted to live, as we say, or used to say in Ireland, he wanted to live in sin with Nora Barnacle without marrying her. And that really would have been hugely frowned upon in the Ireland of his time. He would return to Ireland, and here he would have been unusual to return at all. Firstly, he would have been unusual in that the place he went to, the place he emigrated to, was Europe, was initially to be Zurich, and then it became Trieste in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Most Irish immigrants went to English-speaking countries, to the UK, to Australia, or, of course, to the United States. Joyce chose Europe. Joyce chose Europe for, I think, intellectual reasons, in order to try and reconnect or to connect himself with European art and literature and culture. But his path was not a well-worn path. It was a very unusual one. He was also unusual, as they say, in returning 3 times. Today, the Irish who leave are what we call the Ryanair generation, who can return anytime they want on a cheap flight. This was not the case for Joyce, but he did go back 3 times, but never again after 1912. And he felt utterly rejected by Ireland, who didn't want to publish his books, who didn't support his cultural enterprises, such as setting up a cinema in Dublin. And he created this almost necessary detachment from Ireland in order to write about Ireland. He referred to himself as a voluntary exile. And often he was asked, had he ever thought about going back to Ireland? And his reply to that was, have I ever left? this sense that Joyce had never managed to detach himself from Ireland, that Ireland remained his primary interest. And it is the primary interest of his writing. But he wrote about it, as he says, in Finnegan's Wake, and I quote, from the safe side of distance. Because had he gone back, I think he felt he would have been sucked into Irish politics and not been able to write about it as freely as he did. And he did write about it, and he was connected to it in a way that was most unusual, I would suspect, for an Irish emigrant or expat or exile of his time. It would, of course, have been common for many of them to drink and to sing sad songs about Ireland and the abandoned homeland. They would have sent home remittance money. They would have sent money home to their poor family struggling in Ireland. Joyce very rarely sent money to anybody. In fact, he expected money to be sent to him. Very often, the Irish who left, as I say, were forgotten. And those who did return, particularly after Joyce's time in the 1950s, they were resented. Okay, everybody of my generation had an American uncle. Who came home once every 5 years, the returned Yank. And they were welcomed for the first day or two. And then they had a bit more money than the people at home, and their generosity began to get on people's nerves. And this has been seen in many Irish works of theatre, such as Tom Murphy, who wrote a play, the great Irish playwright, write about this theme, the Irishman returning from the US. In Joyce's time, though, there really was no possibility of return. Although Irish nationalists hoped for a return, as Joyce would show in his chapter Cyclops, which I have quoted in the title of my talk, when I evoked through the Citizen, who is this very narrow-minded Irish nationalist, when he talks about our greater Ireland beyond the sea. And there he's referring very openly to the Irish diaspora. Now, he's in the pub in Dublin, talking to a bunch of people there about the future of Ireland. And how is Ireland to construct its future? He starts off by reconstructing supposed past glories of Ireland, okay, by looking to Irish victories of the past and to Irish noble defeats. And he says, and all our eyes are on Europe, says the Citizen. We had our trade with Spain and the French and with the Flemings before those mongrels were pupped. Spanish ale in Galway, the wine bark on the wine dark waterway. And we will again, says Joe. And with the help of the Holy Mother of God, we will again, says the Citizen, clapping his thigh. Our harbours that are empty will be full again, Kinsale, Galway. And will again, says he, when the first Irish battleship is seen breasting the waves with our own flag to the fore. None of your Henry Tudor harps, no, the oldest flag afloat, the flag of the province of Desmond and Thomond, 3 crowns on a blue field, the 3 sons of Milesius. So he's going back to a time when Ireland was a trading country. Okay, so he's going back to a time when Ireland traded with European countries, with Spain, with the French, with the Flemings. And he's talking about a time when there was mixing, if you like, in Ireland. There was Spanish ale to be found in a city like Galway. And he hopes this time will come again. Okay, this is very close to the kind of political talk of the time that Joyce is giving voice to. Very close to the policies of the then Sinn Féin party, who thought Ireland could begin to become economically more relevant, economically more independent, before perhaps it would become politically independent. This seems to be what the Citizen is evoking. Now, of course, Joyce in Ulysses makes a lot of fun of the Citizen, but he was expressing very similar ideas early on in Trieste himself, when he was a young Irish patriot, about the need for Irish economic growth in Europe. And he saw Europe as the future. And indeed, Europe, but we would need a delay of 50 or 60 years. Ireland would find its future in Europe. It would be partly through connecting properly with Europe that Ireland could fully realize itself economically. So the Irish today are very committed to Europe and to the idea of Europe as this container of opportunity, economic opportunity, cultural opportunity, and also I think as this kind of melting pot. And almost miraculously, Ireland has gone from being a country that was a net exporter of its people to being the second most global economy in Europe in terms of its workforce. 20% of the Irish workforce was born outside of Ireland and are welcomed in the country, and the economy wouldn't survive without them. Now, if you had said to somebody in Joyce's time that this would have happened, I don't think anybody would have believed you. If you'd said to me in 1989, when I left Ireland, because I couldn't get a job there, that we would be exporting 20% of our workforce from abroad, I don't think I'd have believed you either. Because I was part of a generation that Ireland referred to as the young Europeans, because we were trained in Ireland, we got our degrees in Ireland, and we were exported. And I have a lot of contemporaries of my own age who are still dotted around the globe. Now, some of them have come back. Things have improved, as I say. But this idea of the future in which Ireland would reconnect with European realities like Spain and France and the Netherlands is already there in Joyce. This idea of some kind of national regeneration by connection with Europe, okay? And not simply national reaction to the British presence. This is what Joyce often evokes, okay? This is to try and get out of that binary. However, of course, it's interesting that the Citizen would refer to the British as those mongrels. A mongrel is, of course, a mix, a dog which is made up of various different varieties, not a thoroughbred, not a purebred. And this is how the Citizen denigrates the British by talking about them in this way. And in a way, all he's doing, but he doesn't realize it, is aping the way the British would have talked about the Irish and many of its other subject races around the world as mongrels. Okay, so he's giving them back their own kind of language, because he says, rather unrealistically probably, we'll put force against force, says the Citizen. We have our greater Ireland beyond the sea. They were driven out of house and home in the Black 47. But those who came to the land of the free remember the land of bondage. And they will come again, and with a vengeance, no cravens, the sons of Granuaile, the champions of Kathleen Ní Houlihan. So he evokes a future battle against the British. This is 1904, okay? Force against force. And he seems to be putting his faith in the Irish diaspora around the world, the greater Ireland beyond the sea, who were driven out of house and home. And he refers to the famine of 1847 to 1850. So those dark, awful, catastrophic years in the middle of the 19th century, which saw the Irish population fall from 9 to 6 million in just 10 years. Okay, which bizarrely and whatever, maybe not bizarrely, but which actually laid the groundwork for Ireland to get on a more stable basis economically by the fact that the population fell by so many. There were fewer mouths to feed. And he evokes Ireland as a country which whose people who've gone abroad will remember the country that they have left behind, the land of bondage. And here he's evoking, perhaps unconsciously, Moses and the Jews who were driven out of their homeland. Okay, and that parallel is constantly there in Joyce as well. Okay, this idea of driving Ireland out of bondage. So there's that parallel, which some Jewish people find sometimes slightly questionable, the Irish loss of its homeland and the Jewish loss of its homeland, and the idea and the hope of reconstructing that homeland once again, of course, was very much for the Jews still an issue when Joyce was writing Ulysses, and it's very present in Ulysses. It's something that Leopold Bloom thinks about again and again and again, with what has happened to the Jews in Europe, and what would happen to the Jews in Europe makes it even more relevant. Now, the diaspora didn't play a huge role in Ireland's eventual struggle for freedom, although quite a bit of money would come to Ireland from the United States, from Irish Americans who would support the cause of Irish freedom, and also from Great Britain, Irish people who were living there. I don't think Joyce could have imagined that would have happened. I think he's making fun of this idea, but of course they proved to be an important to play an important role in the construction of the Irish state and in the conditions for the Irish state through the 1916 Rising, the War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish War. Their role was important, and some of Joyce's friends took part in that propaganda campaign, particularly in the United States, in favour of Ireland. One would be the poet Port Colum, who played an important role in America around that time. And Joyce would later have become aware of it. So Joyce himself is a member of the Irish abroad, and unusually, he's a member of the Irish abroad who feels free to express his opinions on the home country, as I said, from the safe side of distance. But he certainly wasn't embraced at home for his opinions. Quite the contrary. His home thoughts from abroad, to quote Robert Browning's poem, went down like a lead balloon in Ireland. And it was felt in the nationalist atmosphere of Ireland in the 1920s and 1930s that someone like Joyce had no right to have any say in the situation in Ireland at the time. His contemporary, the noted critic Daniel Corkery, was one of the chief arbiters of the country's literary culture in what was a very isolationist Ireland in the early decades of the 20th century, right up, I would say, till the 1960s. And Corkery was very dismissive of the reliance on foreign critics to decide what was good or bad in Irish literature. He felt this was something for the Irish to decide themselves. He felt that a normal literature, I'm using his terminology, while welcoming the criticism of outsiders, neither lives nor dies by such criticism. It abides the judgment of its own people, and by that judgment lives or dies. Well, if Joyce had been waiting for the judgment of his own people to see if Ulysses would live or die, it would have died very quickly, because it got so little notice in the Ireland of his time that was positive or that was seeing something useful for the country. And I still to this day believe that Joyce wrote Ulysses primarily for an Irish audience. He held up his cracked looking glass so the Irish people could see themselves, so that he could, I think he like Yeats, had a very great desire to try and somehow improve his country through his writing, to make his country at least think, because he felt there was far too much casual, obsequious obeisance to the Catholic Church, which seemed to deprive the people of the capacity to think. And it was precisely Joyce's view in this regard that I think caused such panic and alarm in Dublin among the powers that were in the 1920s and 1930s. Powers led by people like Daniel Corkery, who resented, as I say, the interference, as he would have seen it, of Irish expat writers daring to give their opinion on Ireland and then being unappreciated and perhaps misunderstood, as he would have seen it, by foreign critics. A normal literature for Corkery is a literature which is written at home in the country. The same thing should apply for a normal Irish literary criticism. It was something to be done in-house. Joyce, without the criticism of outsiders, would have been ignored at home. Corkery foresaw no place for the exiled writer and declared, as I say, that a normal literature is written within the confines of the country which names it. It is not dependent on expatriates. Corkery's criteria for establishing the value of Irish literature were what it had to say about Irish nationality, Catholic religion, and the question of the land. Okay, these were his three issues: nationality, religion, and the land. And these were the very forces, nationality and religion and the Irish land, which had driven Joyce into exile and which drove, in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Stephen Dedalus into exile. So we see Joyce diametrically opposed to a writer and a critic of his own generation. Joyce, for the vast majority of Irish literary critics and Irish people, indeed, who never read him, was one who had gone astray, who had lost his way. And it was Corkery's influential belief, and I'm taking Corkery as an example of many people who felt this way. He felt that for writers who left the country, Ireland was never a patria in any sense. These are his words. Ireland, for writers who left the country, was never a real patria in any sense. So they denied the belonging to this patria, to this homeland, to those who leave. That's what the cultural nationalists do, because they can't bear the criticism that might come from abroad. They are seen as being unpatriotic. If you're denied the patria, then you don't belong. You cannot be a patriot in any sense. Expatriation, to use his word, was nothing less than, and I quote, a chronic disease. A chronic disease from Goldsmith's time to our own time of Shaw and Yeats and George Moore. So these were diseased, misguided people who relinquished all right to comment on their country because they were overly influenced by what he called alien considerations. So, I mean, there's a big question here, isn't there? What does a country which has a significant diaspora and some great writers in that diaspora, how does the country come to terms with what those diaspora writers have to say about the home country? I mean, I would be fascinated to know, for example, in terms of India today, what Indian critics have to say about someone like Amitav Ghosh, who writes in a way about that country and about things like migration. So maybe I can get some information about that from you towards the end. And who's hugely popular on my side of the world, but perhaps not as much on your side of the world. So that would be, for me, fascinating conversation to have. However, going back to Joyce, as I said, there was very little space for Joyce's voice in the years before and in the decades following his death. Even in his death, magazines and church organs found little or no good to say about him. His passing was marked in editorials such as this one, which opened in the Irish Rosary: "We never found occasion to write about James Joyce when he was alive, and we feel no inclination to write about him now that he is dead." And yet there they are writing about him, despite their lack of inclination. They did write about him. They wrote about him at length, describing Joyce's evil influence, the boundless, and then complaining about the boundless admiration that he enjoyed in the press, and, quote, his bartering of an intellectual pearl of great price for the husks of intellectual sin, his having, quote, fouled the nest that was his native city. And I think that sums up the Irish attitude to Joyce at this time. He fouled the nest. Okay, he had no right to do this. And how did he foul the nest? Through blasphemy and obscenity, and his failure to be reconciled to Christ on his deathbed. These were this awful mixture of nationalism and religion all the time in how Joyce was read. So this was the situation in Ireland with regard to Joyce. But when Mary Collum, his friend in New York, tried to have a mass said for his to mark his death, she couldn't find an Irish priest who would say mass for Joyce. So again, even within the Irish diaspora, who were often even more reactionary than the Irish at home, Joyce was treated in a very similar way. Now, there were people in Ireland who, of course, got Joyce from an early date. One of them was Elizabeth Bowen, the great writer herself, and she talked very beautifully, I think, about the difficulty of exile for Joyce. I think she was one of the few to see it from his point of view, the pain of exile, the pain of being cut off, and the idea that exile and expatriation was looked on in Ireland as a black mark. She also complained that foreign veneration of Joyce didn't make it any easier for him to be appreciated at home. The Irish didn't want to be bullied into accepting Joyce and embracing his beliefs. In the 1940s and 50s, there was an Irish writer, another exile, called Hubert Butler, who had lived some of his time in Yugoslavia and also in Trieste, where, of course, Joyce lived for a long time. He wrote perceptively about Joyce and exile. As a young man, Joyce had in Butler's words, Joyce had a clearly conceived ideal. He believed that Ireland could realize itself by becoming more European, and the choice must have presented itself to him frequently of being a European in Ireland or an Irishman in Europe. The second alternative was chosen only when it was clear that it was the least impossible to do. So it was not an ideal solution, but there was no way he could live as a European in Ireland. That wouldn't be tolerated. But perhaps he could live as an Irishman in Europe. And that's effectively what, of course, he did, even though he had an extraordinary capacity to immerse himself, emerge himself in his, what he called La Mia Seconda Patria when it came to Trieste. But the choice of choosing to be an Irishman in Europe and relinquish belonging or the possibility of being a European in Ireland came at a great price for Joyce. And Butler directly alluded to this when he published a translation from the Greek of Caffafi's poem, The City, which he dedicated to the memory of Joyce and Trieste. In Butler's translation, the you of the poem refers to Joyce, but also, of course, to Butler himself. And I read, "You said, I'll seek some other land, far off with sails unfurled. I'll find a worthier town than this, and some serener clime. For here ambition foiled is like a crime. The quickening impulse of the heart is dead, and sluggish thoughts entomb the past like lead." So what Butler is essentially saying is that Joyce looked for a serener clime, looked for an easier city, but of course could never detach himself from the city that he had left behind. The mere fact of leaving does not gift the exile with freedom. Rather, he will find, and I quote from the poem, "Your city will go with you." So there's no getting away, seems to be what Caffafi through Butler is saying. There is no getting away for Joyce for sure. If Butler underlined the burden of Joyce's belonging, Elizabeth Bowen, that I just mentioned, appealed for a moving away from both the Irish habit of casting him as a notorious exiled rebel and from what she called worship from abroad, a foreign generation that was resented and complicated in his own terms, complicated his acceptance at home. Ireland, Elizabeth Bowen says, on the year of Joyce's death, needed to embrace Joyce on its own terms. And it would take Ireland the next 6 decades, from 1940 up to about 2000, to begin to embrace Joyce on its own terms. Okay, Irish academia steered away from Joyce. Nobody wanted to give lectures about Joyce or teach him in university or teach him in school. And it was really only as a kind of a byproduct of post-colonial criticism, that Joyce began to be reintegrated into the family of Irish literature. Now, the rejection of Joyce, I think, was also partly the rejection of the very diaspora itself, the Irish diaspora. Okay, the diaspora was useful when it could send home money, but the diaspora's views on the limits of Irish society were not welcomed. The diaspora itself was not welcomed. And this didn't really change in Ireland, I think, until the 1990s, when we had the election of our first woman president, Mary Robinson. And she made it a central part of her presidency to embrace the Irish abroad, the entitlement of all persons who lived abroad, who were born abroad, to belong. And this was merely acknowledging, if you like, what the Irish Constitution said about its diaspora. It says it is the entitlement, and I read from the Constitution, it is the entitlement and birthright of every person born in the island of Ireland, which includes its islands and seas, to be part of the Irish nation. That is also the entitlement of all persons otherwise qualified in accordance with law to be citizens of Ireland. Furthermore, the Irish nation cherishes its special affinity with people of Irish ancestry living abroad who share its cultural identity and heritage. This was the Constitution, but Ireland didn't live up to this Constitution of cherishing, of the Irish nation cherishing its special affinity with people of Irish ancestry living abroad. There was some lip service paid to this, but it really wasn't until the 1990s that this began to become a real attitude, if you like, a real stance. And this was thanks to Mary Robinson. In the largely ceremonial role of president, she had a kind of role of morally persuading Irish people to embrace the diaspora. Not simply because they were useful, but because they felt a sense of belonging. And so this was a way of overcoming and coming to terms with the huge trauma of enforced migration that was central to Irish history. Irish history is a history of migration, of emigration, of poverty, of famine, of defeat. And so all of those who left were forgotten about, and only periodically and occasionally remembered. And Robinson's role in re-embracing this side of our population, this huge number of Irish people around the world, or people who felt Irish belonging, and this was what she managed to do. She regularly reiterated her conviction that the painful pattern of emigration has resulted, ironically, in a vibrant resource that should be included into a modern sense of Irishness. And this modern sense of Irishness and inclusion that she wished for, Joyce could become part of this. No, this Ireland that was changing, that was slowly breaking itself free, not only from centuries of British rule, but also from centuries of Roman rule, of Catholic rule. And Joyce's place in all of this became very, very important. And this push, if you like, continued under the next president, under Mary McAleese, President McAleese. She too popularized the notion of a global Irish family as a resource and as a strength, and something which would allow Ireland to reimagine itself. Okay, so I believe that Joyce's Ulysses presented an image of Ireland in 1922 that was vastly and radically different to the Ireland that was taking shape. Therefore, he was rejected. Okay, it's almost like an alternative Ireland of openness, of toleration, of justice, of live and let live. Okay, as expressed in a character like Leopold Bloom. This image, this vision, if you like, this Joycean vision was for decades rejected. And then towards the end of the 20th century, finally, it began to be accepted again, and to become a resource for Ireland. And I think to play a role in letting Ireland move on. So what Ireland did was finally come to terms in some way with its diaspora. Of course, it's never a finished product. It's never a culminated process. Just at the same time that Ireland began to become a somewhat hospitable place for migration from other countries around the world. Finally, Ireland had to look at itself and look at its own history as it faced the arrival of so many foreign people arriving, often in search of economic survival, often fleeing from war. And this is something that Ireland is now having to deal with, like the rest of Europe, as we come to terms with this dreadful situation in the Ukraine, of how to absorb and give shelter and home to these people, just as Irish people were absorbed and given shelter back in the 19th century during our own famine and so on. So if there's any truth in Irish history, if there's any sense of really acknowledging our own history, we have no choice but to be hospitable in some way. And I'm not saying we're getting it all right. We don't. We have a terrible system of direct provision for people who have come. With regard to the Ukraine, we're getting it better. Certainly better than our neighbour, the UK. we have actually accepted more refugees than the UK from the Ukraine as things stand. And that's an astonishing thing if you think that we have a population of 5 million as against the 60 million that's over in Britain. But I suppose that suggests to me what has happened to Britain. Britain has become that nationalist, inward-looking little England that resembles the little Ireland that Joyce had to get away from, that nationalist, isolationist-looking country. And it's a sad thing to have to say, but that is what Britain has become at the moment, and is anything but welcoming to Ukrainians, for example, at the moment. But I mean, maybe you have in your history to have lived through difficulties like famine and migration to understand what these things mean. And certainly this is not part of the British history, certainly not in recent centuries. So maybe that can help explain that. So I've gone on various different paths and tried to use Joyce and tried to use Ulysses to talk about, how these themes of migration, of diaspora, of the role of the diaspora then in influencing how a country changes or doesn't change. And I hope it's of some relevance to the overall themes of your conference. I'm going to stop there, and I'm very happy to try and answer questions or have comments. Thank you. I'm not hearing anything. Am I supposed to? Yeah.
Can you hear me now, John?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. You've actually, as you said, you've gone on different directions, different headings, and tried to use Joyce as a kind of a barometer for changes in Irish outlook, in the way in which Ireland has conceived itself over the last 50 years or 100 years, perhaps. Uh, you did refer to India, and you talked about the reaction or the reactions that are elicited by writers of the diaspora. For example, writers like Amitav Ghosh. You did mention Amitav Ghosh. It's a very interesting question that you've raised, actually, because as you quite rightly point out, the novelty and the power of these diasporic writers is felt more outside India. Uh, Inside India, people think that Indian culture is being used in a certain way for specular effects. For example, something which is more novel or experientially powerful for a European or an American audience, something which is just part of our daily lives. So again, sometimes people don't tend to understand exactly what writers like Jhumpa Lahiri and Amitav Ghosh are all about. What is the hoopla about them? They sometimes don't understand. They say that this is just our ordinary lives, the way in which Indians go about their work, or um, as modern day Indians who have one foot in the past and one foot in a very global culture that is, everywhere in the world. So they don't understand exactly where the power of a diasporic writer really is, because they think that it's a reiteration of something which they already know. On another point, I would want to get your opinion on something that you did mention, William Butler Yeats, and of course Joyce. Um, there is always this in Yeats, of course, there was always this mythic equivalent, this myth that is always around, the air of myth that is around. And when he used English language, wasn't there always a kind of a journey away or a journey back involved? Because here he was talking about Celtic myths, but he was using the English language. On the one hand, it was a slightly celebratory note. On the other one, a more tragic one, that he could not use the language that was of Cuchulainn and the struggles of Fergus and everything that he talks about. He's using a English language of the colonial master, the language of the colonial masters, to describe something which is inherently a part of his culture. So there was always a journey, and perhaps also with Joyce, and he would be the best person to comment on this. Even every time Joyce takes up his pen to write about Ireland, isn't there this journey already, always already, inside that attempt to write in English? That here is a journey being either made towards or away from a certain homeland, that is language. If language is a homeland, if language itself is a house that you either go away from or return to, isn't that already implied over there? That's number one. And the second little point that I wanted to make was that you talked about. We can talk about Joyce as one of those great epic writers, almost fabulous, who create the context. He talked about Joyce being accepted on his own terms. He talked about can Joyce be accepted on his own terms? I mean, because everybody was applying their own standards to Joyce. No one was trying to understand him on his own terms. It's what he wanted to do. So there are certain writers. Joyce is one of them. There are several others, perhaps a Blake, perhaps, or a Milton, perhaps before, who created the mythology surrounding them, by which you had to understand their writing. So Joyce demands that. Sometimes, in a way, Joyce demands that you first appreciate the worldview that he creates around the text, and then you get to the text, slowly move into a text. Don't you think that that is also the case with Joyce? Perhaps he's one of those great writers who create the context first, and then you move in. So unless you accept the context of the production of his text, it is impossible sometimes to really relate to his texts. The alienness or the adverse reaction sometimes that you get remains as in the undergrowth, to use that term perhaps. So these are the two little points that I have to make. John, could you please respond to that?
Thank you. They're not little points at all. They're quite complicated points. Yeah, I mean, obviously the relationship with the Irish language is a key one. Yeats, of course, didn't really have any Irish, so he was very aware that he was writing in a second-hand language. And of course, today, it's both Yeats and Joyce's great fortune that they wrote in English and not in Irish, because we have any number of great Irish language writers who are largely nobody knows about them. And we've had several attempts in the 20th century of writers who've said that Michael Hartnett, the poet, his farewell to English, and he abandoned English and spent 20 years writing in Irish, and everybody forgot about him, even though his poems in Irish are wonderful. Joyce described having to write in English as the greatest torture ever invented. And he felt that in terms of both the structural limits of the English language, but surely also in terms of the whole imperialist imposition of the English language in Ireland. And so he struggled with it. But, you know, writers like Andrew Gibson in his book Joyce's Revenge have shown how he took that language and demolished it, and the English language was never the same again after Joyce. So on some level, Joyce is the Irish writer getting his own back on both the English language and the English novel, because Ulysses also is, in a sense, the end of the English novel as we knew it. I mean, I know people still write novels like they did in the 19th century, but the kind of modernist novel, the more ambitious kind of novel after Joyce, things were never, as you said in your introduction, were never really the same again. I also agree with you that, as you said, Joyce kind of creates his own context, and in order to be read in that context, and it has taken us a long time to understand that context. I mean, as Richard Ellman famously said in 1959, we're still learning to read Joyce, and it's still true today. We're still learning to read Joyce, and his contexts are multiple. They're Irish, but they're also European, and he's got a foot in both camps. And in a sense, I think he wrong-foots his readers all the time, We are constantly being disoriented. We are all, in a sense, foreigners before Joyce's text. No? Yes, there are episodes in Ulysses, like the Cyclops, which an Irish person can get more quickly than a non-Irish person. But you go to the Oxen of the Sun, and we're all a bit lost. Go to Finnegan's Wake, and nobody can feel at home in what is an almost alien language. And I mean, that sense of living in an alien language is very much something that somebody who's lived as a migrant for 40 years or an exile for 40 years can be very much at home with. I mean, Joyce's whole moving around Europe, from speaking Italian or the Triestine dialect to speaking Swiss German to speaking French to speaking English. I mean, all that mixing, that confusioning of languages, I think is reflected in his writing. So it's very hard for any of us to feel at home within any one single context.
Thank you, John. Our time is almost up. We are exactly on time, it seems. We have kept to the clock. Thank you so much again. We talked about Joyce wrong-footing his readers, but we have had absolutely sure-footed analysis of Joyce, his Ulysses, and the way in which it has morphed in its afterlife with Irish history, with Irish visions of the world. Thank you so much, John, for joining our conference from faraway Mccourt in Italy, and taking time off and enriching us. So, first day of the conference, we have 2 more days, but it will resound with your ideas. Thank you so much for being with us, John.
Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the next couple of days. I'm sure you will. Okay.
Absolutely.
Talk to you soon. Take care.
Take care. You take care as well. See you
Okay.
soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.